right? So I suppose that's my first question to you, Gary. Do you need to change your training program massively when you are, entering into a fat loss phase? Is there a difference? Like, is there a reason, theoretically, is there a reason physiologically why we would go, you know what, during a muscle gain phase or a maintenance phase or whatever, it makes sense for your training to look like X. Does it make sense to, or does it make sense to then change it when we're like, oh, we need to go for fat loss?
Yeah, my general perspective is no. And the reason for that goes along with a fairly common phrase, and that is, that which builds muscle is that which will keep it. And if you've always been training a particular way and it's led to great gains in muscle, then that's going to be what keeps the muscle around as well during the fat loss process. And, your answer to that might be, well, Gary, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of muscle maintenance. I was just thinking about it in terms of fat loss, how I can maximize my fat loss. And the reality is that you don't really want to be using your resistance training as a fat loss tool, because it's a very inefficient and fatiguing way of doing so. Because if your training is already set up in such a way that you've been training to build muscle, so let's say you're doing 5 days of weight training per week, a lot of weight training, you could do 6 days, twice a day, really high reps, lots of sets, and burn a lot more calories. But you're also increasing your risk of under recovery, potentially injury. You mightn't be adapting to the training that you're doing. You're spending more time in the gym, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you were to do something like keep your weight training standardized with the aim of maintaining your muscle, and then maybe do more steps throughout the day or add in a cardio session that's lower in fatigue, that's going to allow you to burn more calories without all of that additional fatigue that comes with extra weight training. So I think your weight training should always be aimed at your primary goals. So beyond fat loss, what's the actual aim of your training? Is it to develop strength? Is it to support your sport? Is it to build muscle? And keep your training in line with that goal. That's not to say that there's no difference in energy expenditure from different weight training programs. Of course there is. And there's also a significant difference between individuals. If you can squat 300 kilos, and the definition of work from a physics perspective is the amount of force multiplied by the displacement of that load. So if you're moving a 300 kilo barbell versus a 30 kilo barbell, you're doing a lot more work, and thus your body has to use more energy to produce that work. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. We're still following the laws of physics. So as a result, that means that much stronger people doing the same amount of sets are going to be burning a lot more energy when they're in the gym versus people who are really light. And that then can vary depending on how fit someone is. So if someone is super fit, they might recover from their weight training really easily. Whereas someone who is, quite unfit, they might be, have an elevated heart rate throughout the session and they're not recovering between sets. And that might lead them to burn more energy within the session, but we would hardly consider it to be a good thing that person is less fit and less able to tolerate their training. We know that that person is going to be less recovered after the session and more fatigued, which can then carry over into reductions in non-exercise activity beyond the gym, and also subsequent declines in performance or lack of adaptation from that training. So overall, I think it's pretty clear that if you're adopting a fat loss process with respect to both training and nutrition, your training should stay aimed at your primary training goals. It supports fat loss for sure, but it shouldn't be viewed as your most potent fat loss tool. And I would rather someone try to standardize their daily activity, get their training in to support their goals, and then keep their calories on track. And I think that's really what you need to be thinking about doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I always think of it like your resistance training, it's not a fat loss tool. Well, obviously it helps with fat loss, like we just discussed. Like all training is, good for fat loss to an extent, obviously, if calorie deficit is created, etc. Right? But resistance training, the goal of resistance training is to get stronger or to build muscles, or should say, and or build muscles, because you can get stronger without potentially building muscle, right? But if you think of it purely from a calorie burning perspective, you're always going to start trying to manipulate your resistance training in a way to maximize that. And you're going to come up with different protocols, different, strategies, whatever, so that you can get more calorie burn. But like Gary mentioned there, like sometimes this can be a little bit of a a false god, if you will, where you're like, oh, well, if I just do more volume, I'll end up burning more calories, because I'm just doing more work overall. But in reality, it's like, well, like that's not necessarily true, because if you had gotten stronger throughout the process, potentially they would end up being the same. Obviously, again, huge amount of variance. It's hard to say. Like if you go from doing 1 set to 5 sets, like I don't care how fucking strong you get, like it's going to be a little bit of a difference. So it can be a little bit of a false god when you're thinking, oh, well, I'll just switch to doing higher volume because I want to get more calorie burn. Like it's not, that's not always the case. And also there is a trade-off with that, which is, maybe you don't build as much muscle, right? Because you have to do more volume and now you're not going as close to failure. Or perhaps, you get more muscle building. I don't know what your training has been like. There's so many questions to answer within this, so many little nuances to this, depending on where you are currently at, right? But we definitely don't want to think of resistance training as purely a calorie burn perspective, because again, it incentivizes poor resistance training practices, which usually end up not leading to the best strength outcomes or not leading to the best muscle building outcomes, right? And you've seen this before. You might have experienced this yourself, where you try to maximize, oh, it's all about the calorie burn. Maybe you have something like an Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever other calorie tracking device, and you're like, oh, I'm going to go into a training session and I'm going to try to burn X amount of whatever calories, right? And you're going to try to burn through so many calories throughout the whole session, and you're like, I'm going to do XYZ to achieve that. I'm going to do extra sets, I'm going to do drop sets, I'm going to do supersets, I'm going to do whatever, right? You're going to do all these different things to make sure that the calorie burn target is hit, right? And you see people do this all the time, and what you often see is these people are just as strong as they were when they started doing this stuff, and like they're no stronger right now. Maybe they might be a bit more adapted to that training. Like they used to be able to do, I don't know, fucking lunges with 35 kilos, say, for example. And then when they started doing these supersets and whatever else, it's like they had to drop that down to 15 kilos and now they're back up to 35. It's like, yeah, well, like you didn't actually get any stronger. Like, yeah, you're more adapted to this, work output in a unit of time, this density of work, if you will, but you didn't actually get any stronger overall, right? So it's like, okay, we're not actually getting stronger. And it's like, is it actually better from a muscle building perspective? Well, it's hard to say. If you're not going to maximize the amount of weight you can effectively lift, if you're not going to maximize that progressive tension overload, like you're probably not going to get the best muscle building outcomes. And this is especially true because once people switch to this, like, oh, it's all about the calorie burn perspective, they start, having real sloppy technique. It's just like, oh, I need to get through like 15, 20, 30, 50 reps or whatever it is, the target that they've put for themselves. And it's like, they're just kind of going through the motions. They're not actually connected with that because they're thinking like, oh, it's all about calorie burn. It's not about, weight on the bar. It's not about, exercise technique. It's not about like getting these like really crisp, beautiful reps or anything like that. It's like, no, it's all about getting my heart rate jacked up. I could, do some, nicer technique, some heavier weight or whatever, but I'm not going to do that because I'm going to try superset this with this other exercise and I'm going to be like running around the gym like a fucking madman, right? And it's like, what is that actually getting you? Because even if we say that's better for fat loss, right? Now, most people, as we said, fat loss is not the only goal. Someone wants to become more capable with their training. Like if you're going to put in 4 or 5 fucking 10 hours of work into the gym, you want to get a return from that. You don't want to just be, again, a smaller version of yourself, right? Even if it is a fat loss diet that you have, like you want to come out the back end of that and you want to be like, oh, I've actually, increased my muscle a little bit here, here, and here. I've also built a bit more strength. I'm more capable of doing, I don't know, chin-ups, dips, bodyweight exercises generally get easier when you weigh less, but you're like, I'm actually stronger at my overhead press or my deadlift or whatever. Like you're looking for these little improvements along the way. And then also your fitness as well, which we'll touch on in the next podcast on cardio. But it's like you want to be fitter, or you want to get like a lower resting heart rate, you want to get all these other adaptations that are helpful, beneficial, increase VO2 max, whatever, right? It's like, if we don't train effectively for those other goals and all we do is maximize calorie burn, it's again, it's kind of empty. It's like, okay, cool, like you lost some fat, but you're no better as a human. Like you're not stronger, you're not fitter, you're not whatever. It's like you're kind of the exact same. And again, you see this all the time, and people just, you know, spin their wheels in the gym where it's like you're not getting stronger, you're not building muscle, you've incentivized these really poor training practices, so you don't actually end up getting all these other benefits from resistance training because all you care about is this calorie burn, you know. And also it's kind of, it can definitely be disruptive to your life, especially if you have like a calorie burn target, because it's like, oh, I have an hour to train in the gym, I haven't hit my target. And now it's like, okay, well, I have to add on 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever onto that. And it's like, yeah, well, you were actually supposed to pick up the fucking kids. So, you know, it can be quite disruptive. But what are your thoughts, Gary?
I agree. I mean, I don't think I have anything else to add there. I think it's pretty straightforward. You know, I don't think there's anything to add. You're right. Correct. Agreed.